you. I'm Albena AZMANOVA. I'm professor of political and social science at the University of Kent. So I'm happy to convene this first panel, which will, focus in on the interactions between multilateralism, multi-order world, and populism, the main topic of our conference here. So we have the two contributions. So there's a slight change of program. We have two contributions, first by Dr. Stewart Patrick, who is a senior fellow and director of the Global Order and Institutions program at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And then we will hear from Dr. Viktor JAKUPEC, who is honorary professor of international development at the Faculty of Art and Education, Deakin University in Australia. He is also a faculty member of the Economics and Social Sciences at Potsdam University in Germany. So I now give the floor to Stewart Patrick, who will address the topic. His paper is Reimagining Global Economic Governance and the State of the Global Governance.
Thank you very much, Professor AZMANOVA. I want to congratulate Irina von Wies and Ibrahim Öztürk and their colleagues for putting this together. It's a great collection of luminaries, and I very much enjoyed Barry Axford's wonderful overview. Really terrific, sir. So I'm honored to be in such esteemed company. I want to speak today a bit about the crisis of global neoliberalism and whether it's possible to imagine a new model of global economic governance that might be more just, resilient, and sustainable, and that also might deliver essential global public goods. And I would put it in the context of some of the major, of the broader crisis of world order that we're seeing. Obviously, we're living in a period of extraordinary turbulence that's caused many to reconsider some long-standing assumptions about the world economy. And over the last decade, we've seen growing, almost it's become conventional wisdom, that neoliberal ideology that shaped and governed the world economy for many years has often failed to deliver prosperity, economic resilience, political stability, or environmental stewardship. And the shortcomings of hyperglobalization, and particularly the financialization of the world economy, are increasingly apparent. And the inadequacy of existing arrangements were obviously accentuated and exposed by a series of recent shocks, from the global financial crisis to COVID-19, to the resurgence of geopolitical conflict, the deepening climate crisis, and of course, the revolution in digital technology that Barry spoke about. And this actually opens some avenues conceivably for major institutional change, because as we know from history, crises of these sorts can loosen attachment to existing orthodoxies and have people look in other directions, as well as open the possibility for new political coalitions. So around the world, we've seen governments and publics seeking in their own ways to renegotiate the terms of their integration of the global economy, or protesting, perhaps particularly with respect to populism, existing arrangements. So the idea here is they want to chart their own course. They want to regain control, assert their sovereignty, as Barry mentioned, and they want to be able to pursue distinct preferences amongst these in the areas of social welfare, industrial policy, development priorities, environmental goals, and national security objectives. I think what's different compared to previous instances of objections to globalization is that much of the critique is coming from globalization's historic champions, not least in the United States. And I think there's also, though, an increase in accompanying conviction, at least at the global level, that the major institutions of global economic governance and the rules of the global economy are no longer fit for purpose. They don't reflect major shifts in power and demography, and they struggle to address global challenges that were hardly imagined when the existing foundations of many of these institutions were laid down. For instance, artificial intelligence or the governance of outer space, to just pick two examples. Pressure is also growing to transform the architecture of international cooperation so that it's more responsive to developing country needs, but there also obviously are tensions with many wealthy countries in terms of what that would look like. UN, it is quite striking that both the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, and even the managing director of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva, have called explicitly for, quote, a new Bretton Woods moment. And if you think about what the original Bretton Woods settlement entailed, this would be at least in some measure, an effort to restore the social bargain that was at the heart of the post-war global economic settlement, one that the late John Ruggie called the compromise of embedded liberalism. That compromise importantly left significant autonomy to national governments to pursue domestic purposes. But it's also clear that going back to the future isn't going to be enough because the global context is so different and the transnational and even planetary challenges that we confront now are more complicated. We need new rules and institutions for today's political economy. And we need a new narrative to help explain and legitimate this approach. This narrative also problematically needs to span nations that may agree that the current world economy is not working, but disagree on what ails it, much less the specific remedies. To further complicate matters, we face not only a crisis of neoliberalism, but as Barry mentioned, a crisis of multilateralism and indeed a crisis of the global order itself. Around the world, many governments and publics have lost faith in current frameworks of international cooperation, regarding them as alternatively or collectively incapable of delivering security and incapable of delivering prosperity and well-being, corrosive of national identity, illegitimate and unrepresentative in their government, unresponsive to new challenges, and lacking in accountability, as well as threatening of national sovereignty. So this obviously is a driving force. I'm not a major student of populism, although I have written a bunch on the nature of sovereignty and desires of taking back control. And I think this loss of faith of globalization is without question a driving force behind nationalist, populist, and often authoritarian politics that are the subject of this conference, which complicates efforts to revive multilateralism. So given these dynamics, is it actually realistic to imagine a more equitable and responsive globalization that can balance the realities of global pluralism and preference diversity with the imperative of at least some basic common rules and cross-border cooperation? And importantly, is it possible to conceive of a framework of global economic governance that gives more voice and weight to the global majority, as well as non-state stakeholders? And what would this look like? For would-be reformers, a core dilemma is how to reconcile the domestic and international sides of this equation by updating multilateral institutions that help mitigate the negative spillovers of national policy choices, cushion societies from systemic shocks like the ones we've found, and advance the interests of all countries and populations. So the question is, can we envision a new paradigm that respects diverse preferences, but also promotes adherence to shared rules? Before turning to that question and to some reasons why there actually is possibilities of being hopeful, I want to pull back a bit and address some of the concerning trends that we've seen. These calls to reform global economic governance are not occurring in a vacuum, but unfolding it in a context, as I mentioned, of a broader crisis of world order, which is fragmenting, undermining international cooperation at the precise moment that it's most needed, as Barry mentioned. Now, the phrase world order or global order is a bit bloodless, and so one has to be a little bit more specific as to what we're talking about. I mean, at a minimum, it implies a degree of predictability or pattern of regularity in interstate relations. Historically, all enduring international orders have relied not only on a stable power distribution, although one debates whether or not it's multipolar or hegemonic, but also on some basic consensus among nations, particularly the most important on certain principles of conduct. Such normative agreement helps temper the structural anarchy in a system of independent states. Now, it goes without saying that the quality, depth, and scope of world order has varied dramatically over time. For much of history, of course, world politics was governed by only a few basic rules of peaceful coexistence, and a truly global order as we know it today, based on the principle of sovereign equality, began to emerge only after the Second World War. Importantly, though, from our perspective, the post-war decades and what makes them distinct is distinctive is that we saw a remarkable proliferation of international organizations, frameworks, regimes, and treaties across virtually every global domain, a process that accelerated, at least initially, when the Cold War ended. And this lattice work of intergovernmental cooperation, complemented by transnational networks of non-governmental actors, has permitted an unprecedented, if still very uneven, degree of governance in world politics that one could argue was not there before. So we can actually speak of global governance where we couldn't really before. While no single country created this order, it shaped, obviously owed a great deal to the conscious effort by the United States and its closest partners to build an open world grounded in new multilateral institutions, one that they believed would be conducive to capitalism, to democracy, and collective defense. Again, needless to say, this was a deeply imperfect order, one redolent of imperial dynamics, particularly in the periphery. Nevertheless, the multilateral architecture that evolved was quantitatively and qualitatively different than anything that had come before. Now, one can debate whether or not this order, which its defenders term the liberal rules-based international order, was particularly liberal, was particularly rules-based, was particularly international, or was particularly orderly. And where one stands on all of those very much depends on where one sits around the globe. But regardless of the degree to which it lived up to its rhetoric and perhaps the more utopian narratives about what it consisted of, that order is clearly on the ropes. And its body blows include resurgent geopolitics and war, surging inequality, a planetary ecological emergency, a global demographic mismatch, disruptive technological trends, a global democratic recession, and a vacuum of leadership. And I'd like to go through those in a bit. But first, I want to highlight that the crisis of multilateralism and world order reflects not only competing material interests, that is, who is up and who's down, but often and increasingly fundamental divergences of world order visions, not least over the purposes that global governance should advance. That is, global governance for what? Nations often disagree on the principles, rules, and norms that should govern conduct in particular spheres. And this is a topic that I wrote about in quite a long Carnegie Endowment working paper called Rules of Order, Assessing the State of Global Governance. And it looks at the fact that these divergences, normative divergences, are pretty apparent, whether one's talking about foundational rules of political order like sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the use of force, or rules for the global economy. For instance, the rules that should govern trade, finance, development, investment, and the like. It's also true for rules governing the global commons, as well as the Earth system when it comes to climate and biodiversity, as well as global health. It's true when one thinks about rapidly emerging digital technologies and other technologies, and also, and unsurprisingly, when it comes to the degree that one believes that principles of human rights and democracy should pervade or be part of global order. So I want to look at a few of the factors destabilizing and fragmenting the world order. The first and most obvious is that geopolitics and war are back. The end of the Cold War, of course, was a time of not only triumphalism, but extraordinary optimism in much of the West, not least in the United States, of course, about democracy, globalization, and cooperation. And as recently as about a decade ago, President Barack Obama could declare that the era of great power competition was a thing of the past, and that international politics had become the management of shared challenges. Now, of course, neither Xi Jinping nor Vladimir Putin received that particular memo, not that they are solely to blame for the resurgence in geopolitics, but obviously East-West antagonism has resurged, most obviously in Ukraine, of course, and over the Taiwan Strait. The incidence of war is also up sharply. Steven Pinker may write about the better angels of our nature, but some of his, at least, writing about the obsolescence of war appeared to be a bit premature. Last year, there were over 180 armed conflicts around the world, and obviously the situation in Gaza being one of the most horrific. Meanwhile, the UN Security Council, partly as a result of this resurgence in geopolitics, is gridlocked in what Secretary General Gutierrez calls colossal global dysfunction. But it's the relations have also deteriorated clearly between wealthy nations and countries of the self-styled global South, who see the rich as indifferent to their needs and unwilling to make room at the global high table. And they have quite a bit of justification for that. Emerging powers like India and Brazil and others are not yet rule breakers, but they're clearly tired of being rule takers, and they want to be rule makers on issues from trade to climate. And this underscores an important point about the whole notion of a rules-based international order, which, you know, Western policy makers and pundits have lamented the decline and the erosion of that order, but they've left a lot of tricky questions unanswered. Most importantly, what rules precisely are they talking about? Where did those come from? They didn't magically appear. How selectively have they been applied in the past, etc. So, as I mentioned, the crisis of world order is not simply with what powers are rising and which are declining within an agreed framework of rules. They're about they reflect normative disagreements about these. And this divergence suggests that the emerging order may be normatively thinner than it has been in the past. Danny Roderick and Steve Walt wrote a very interesting paper in an essay in Foreign Affairs making precisely this point about a year and a half or 2 years ago, basically suggesting that we are facing a world in which global governance needs to aspire to less in some ways because because of these normative differences. And so again, one could easily imagine some of the institutional profusion proliferation that I discussed, either fragmenting or becoming normatively thinner. The second major factor, obviously complicating international order, is that the backlash of globalization continues, and it's propelled by surging global inequality. Obviously, in the 1990s and into the century, many champions of globalization, hyperglobalization, believed that it would bind nations closer together, lift all boasts, and bolster solidarity. That has been buried by the global financial crisis, by US-China decoupling, COVID-19, and the aftershocks of Ukraine, among other issues. And many countries obviously are turning their back on free trade, free flow of capital, and embracing industrial policy. Obviously, surging economic inequality is a huge aspect of this. Many of the gains, well, certainly in the United States, levels of inequality have reached levels that you have not been seen since the Roaring '20s and threaten to bypass those. The big losers in this era have been the lower and middle classes in rich countries. The big winners are obviously the already wealthy and wealthy countries. And those levels of inequality are not only morally obscene, but a recipe for populism and instability. The third major shock has been is the continued fact that we face a global planetary emergency. We are in effect at war with the living planet, with the biosphere. Between 1990 and 2020, a lot of good things happened. The percent of people living in extreme poverty, for instance, at least by some measures, fell from 36% of all people in 1990 in the world to 9%. But much of this progress obviously came at nature's expense, and that bill is coming due. Humans, of course, are the biggest force shaping the Earth system from the atmosphere to the oceans. Every year, every month, we set new records and have blown by already, at least for temporarily, at least, the Paris Agreement target of holding average global temperatures to below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Oceans are warmer than in 100,000 years and 33% more acidic than they were just 200 years ago. And critical components of the Earth system are approaching dangerous tipping points. Biodiversity is also collapsing, jeopardizing the ecosystem services that we get, which, according to even the folks at Davos, the high priests of capitalism, they say that 1/2 of global GDP depends on benefits that we get from nature, benefits that we are in the process of destroying. The fourth challenge is what I would call a demographic mismatch. The world is both too old and too young, and we haven't really figured out how to address this imbalance. A year ago, as you know, a year and a half ago, humanity topped 8 billion for the first time, up from just 5.3 billion in 1990. But obviously, in the wealthy world, we worry much more about underpopulation. In Italy, the fertility rate is 1.23 births per woman, way below replacement. And in South Korea, it's an astonishing 0.84 for women. And so many aging countries, and I don't have to tell those living in Europe, face a fiscal cliff. They don't have enough workers to support pensioners living longer and thankfully healthier lives. Meanwhile, in Africa, the continent is going to see its population double by 2050, when 1 in every 4 people will be African. And that could be a boon if it could harness its demographic dividend. But will the world economy, and to say nothing of national governments, deliver opportunities or more disappointment? Now, there's an obvious demographic solution to this demographic mismatch: higher migration from poor but youthful to richer but aging nations. But the politics of that are just totally toxic, particularly as they relate to undocumented arrivals. If I don't have to tell, again, those living in Europe, but also those who witness the sort of dramas going on the southern border of the United States. And again, that is fuel to the fire for populism. The fifth area, and here I'll pick up on some of Barry's comments, are new risks from technology. We obviously live in a Promethean age. We're in the midst of what Richard Danzig calls a technological tsunami. And, every day seems to be gee whiz advances, bring them gee whiz advances from, AI to nanotech, synthetic biology to quantum computing, et cetera. And if this is leaving us breathless, it's also leaving governments in the dust. And that is a problem, because while these technologies can do amazing things, they also pose extraordinary risks, not least dual use risks. If you consider AI and biotech, they can be used to educate. The first can be used to educate or misinform. The latter can be to develop a vaccine of the latest superbug. I should note that 2 decades ago, it cost $2.7 billion to sequence the first human genome. Today, the price is $600, and you can create new life forms in your garage. More to the point, for our purposes, recent advances in digital technologies in particular threaten massive dislocation in knowledge-based sectors that have heretofore been insulated from technological disruption. High-income workers are now facing at least the risk that low-skilled workers have been facing for decades. These developments, as was noted, are also entrenching the dominance of massive monopolistic private technology platforms that are amongst the most powerful companies the world has ever known, with an influence that exceeds most nation states. The sixth trend that I'll point to is a global retreat in democracy, and obviously the topic of this conference is surge in populism, including of an authoritarian variety. The world is, by some measures, in the 17th year of a democratic recession that it has touched all corners of the globe and weakened support for sustained internationalism, to say nothing of global governance. In addition to the rise of partial democracies and anocracies, many of the biggest recent declines and challenges to democracy have occurred in established democracies, including both the world's largest, India, and the most powerful, the United States. The current technology ecosystem, including the simultaneous pervasiveness and splintering of media, has only reinforced the retreat from a common civil and political culture. It's also provided, of course, as was mentioned, authoritarian governments with unprecedented surveillance capabilities. So the prospects for international cooperation, including on global economic issues, will depend heavily on the outcomes of elections in this pivotal year. And the final factor that I'll mention here is the vacuum of leadership, including doubts about the future of American internationalism, and also whether the United States is actually open to a different style of leadership that is based less on fantasies of exceptionalism and more about the ability to become a quote-unquote more normal power. Since 1945, the vigor of the multilateral system has obviously depended heavily on the United States, which helped to create and in many respects defend this system. American multilateralism has always been fraught, however. It's always been ambivalent and selective. And I've written a bit on that, including in my book, The Sovereignty Wars, Reconciling America with the World. But the Trump administration took that to new levels and marked the ascendancy of a hyper-nationalist, sovereigntist, protectionist, isolationist, and nativist regime that was a qualitative departure from decades of U.S. internationalism, as problematic as sometimes that was. And his reelection in November could herald the third 180-degree turn in U.S. foreign policy in only 8 years. I do want to note at least one ironic aspect of this, given that we're talking about, the rejections of neoliberalism. Ironically, the greatest continuity between the Biden administration and the second Trump administration, however stylistically they would be different, could ironically be precisely in global economic policy. While again, the style would be highly different, we could well see a continuation of some elements, not least in industrial policy and skepticism of the WTO, for instance. Now, given this daunting global context, what are the prospects for forging a new narrative on global economic governance? I don't have any definitive answers, obviously, but just a few thoughts about ways to approach this challenge and some principles that should guide our efforts. I'll try to make this quick to get to our next speaker. First, we need to look at the lessons of history. For example, how policy relevant ideas emerge and acquire political power, including by energizing social movements and mobilizing broad coalitions. As I mentioned, dramatic institutional change historically has often occurred in the aftermath of demonstrable policy failure, moments where crisis or catastrophe discredits established orthodoxies, loosens attachment of policymakers and leaders to old ways of doing things, and leaves them open to considering alternative beliefs, frameworks, or models. And the archetypal example, as you all know, of this is the triumph of Keynesianism in the wake of the Great Depression, World War II in particular, when governments of most developed countries accepted a new role for the state in the market, rejecting the laissez-faire orthodoxy for a more managed form of capitalism that became embodied in and tolerated by the initial Bretton Woods system. That system, in turn, faced challenges of its own in the 1970s, contributing to the triumph of market liberalism in the wake of the Reagan-Thatcher revolution. And importantly, a transformation whose seeds were planted by many historical accounts decades earlier in the work of Hayek, Milton Friedman, and others, and what became a global network of scholars and think tank experts, a revolution that, among other things, transformed modern capitalism. Now, there are efforts afoot, including by a number of foundations, to try to seed precisely this sort of thing in a progressive direction. So I would commend those to you. Some of you already may be involved in those efforts. And again, the question before us today is whether we are another possible inflection point, and what might history teach us about how to reinforce or accelerate this trend. The second point, which is related, is that any reimagined and reformed system of global economic governance would require building a world economy that rewards labor as much as capital. While many of the critical decisions about political economy, including safety nets, for instance, would be domestic ones, I think the multilateral component will be critical. At least some common rules, such as over minimum rates of taxation or subsidies, would be important to ensure that gains from globalization are broadly shared not only within but across countries, in part by preventing a race to the bottom. The first 2 decades after 1945 saw some of the greatest shared prosperity in history, at least within became the OECD world. There were ones in which trade benefited lower classes much more than it does now, and when countries had more flexibility to pursue progressive social policies than they do today. We need to rediscover something along the lines of a compromise of embedded liberalism, which could have the potential to defang populism. Third, we need to govern the world as if the earth mattered. We need to invest in natural capital as much as we do in human, physical, and financial capital. Our environmental emergency reflects a collision between 2 different systems, the Earth system and the international system. The first, obviously, is a living planet as seen from outer space, an integrated entity that recognizes no physical boundaries. The second is a political planet divided up into 193 sovereign nations. Runaway climate change, biodiversity collapse, and rampant pollution have all revealed a fundamental contradiction between these 2 systems and the need to close this gap. It's slowly dawning on us after all these years that nature is not something that's nice to have, but indeed a fundamental precondition for human well-being. And resolving this contradiction requires that we fundamentally overhaul our existing economic models, which continue to treat environmental damage as an unavoidable externality of market activity and extraction, rather than investing in natural capital assets. And so over the past year and a half, we've actually seen some tentative national and multilateral initiatives focusing on climate change that seek to break the long-established narrative pitting climate action against growth and development. Obviously, we've seen lots of EU initiatives. We've seen the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, the global level. We've seen the Bridgetown Agenda, President Macron's summit on a new global financing pact. And we've seen the World Bank's new evolution roadmap, which envisions, quote, a world free of poverty on a livable planet. And all 3 are grounded in 2 propositions. The battle against climate change is not a costly distraction from the imperative development, but an important component of it. And second, poor countries should not have to choose between climate adaptation and mitigation, other development priorities. The question remains, and it's a big question, as to whether or not the wealthy world is going to get anywhere near the financing, which may cost more than $100 trillion through 2050 to meet net zero targets. The last thing that actually, there's a couple more things, and then I'll finish. The fourth thing we need to do is broaden the gains from the digital revolution to create its winner-take-all dynamics. We're all aware of these breathtaking advances in digital technology, but the concentrated benefits are remarkable, and they're remarkably obscene. AI has the potential to become a general purpose technology that could be as ubiquitous and taken for granted as electricity, but obviously its gains remain highly unevenly distributed. Along with my colleague Emma Klein, I've just co-written a Carnegie working paper on the emerging global regime complex for governing AI. And as we point out, there are mind-boggling opportunities for bettering the human condition. But realizing these possibilities will require not only attention to safety and security, but also ensuring the broadest possible access and benefit sharing within and across countries. These goals may not always be consistent, however, with the profit motives of technology platforms. So one of the critical priorities is building out digital public infrastructure, which are secure, interoperable, governed, and trusted systems of digital technologies that private citizens can access and the public can access for public services. One of the critical unknowns when we think about the digital future is which of three global models will dominate. The EU model, which in the new EU Act places accent on rights and privacy, a US model, which emphasizes market efficiency and corporate autonomy, or a Chinese model, which emphasizes authoritarian state control in an Orwellian society. Finally, we need to make room at the top, is my last point. The US and other Western powers need to make space for rising powers in developing countries in major multilateral institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, to say nothing of the UN Security Council. These institutions were created when most nations in the world were still colonies. It is very difficult and not always very popular to give up control, but failing to make some reasonable adjustments will only undermine the legitimacy of these institutions going forward. The unipolar moment is over. Instead of doubling down on primacy at huge expense, the United States in particular needs to reform multilateralism for the coming multipolar moment. I will stop there. I know I put a huge amount on the table, and I apologize if I've gone on a little bit longer, but Albena, over to you.
Thank you, Stewart. Now we will give the floor directly to Viktor JAKUPEC, and then we will discuss the two papers together. Viktor, the floor is yours.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, fine. Let me just try to go to the share screen. If that's going to work. Share. Is the screen visible to everyone?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, so let me start with some basic observations. Firstly, I would like to say that I'm trying to, well, I have put my head on the chopping block because I'm talking about what is going to be in the future without knowing what actually is going to happen between now and when this future arises. So nevertheless, I'm going to look at or discuss, if I may, multipolarity and the post-Ukraine war new world order. Here I assume that there's going to be a new world order, and every indication is that we may experience it. And at the same time, there is a focus on the rise of populism. So to put it in a different way, the basic premise is that the Russian-Ukraine war has intensified the shift from a liberal rules-based world order towards a multipolar populist world order, whatever that may mean. I will come to that. In other words, since the onset of the Ukrainian war, the world experienced a decisive shift to multipolarity. Secondly, it experienced the prospect of new world order or multiplicity of competing world orders, and a rise of national populism in the global north as well as the global south. At the same time, we are seeing that there's a rise in Euroscepticism and aligned with that populism, and that is apparent in quite a number of EU countries, like in Germany with the Alternative für Deutschland, in Austria with the Freiheitliche Partei, in Hungary, in Slovakia, in Portugal, Italy, and France. And more recently, we have seen it also in Argentina. So there's also, as previous speakers have already alerted to, there's a real prospect of Trump's return to the White House, which should cement the US turn to national populism, in my opinion. With this in mind, my questions for today are, how will the Russo-Ukrainian war end? Let's go to the next slide. How will the Russo-Ukrainian war end? What will be the post-Russo-Ukrainian war world order? Now, there are a number of scenarios, and they are not all inclusive. With ending the Ukraine war is that there's a potential of a frozen conflict. There is also a potential of escalation, and winner takes all. So one side wins, the other one loses. More of the same, so a protracted war of attrition, and others like the peace proposals. My thesis is that the post-war setting will see a liberal rules-based order plus a multipolar populist world order. So there will be not one, but there will probably be two or more different competing multipolar populist orders. So now, as I said before, much will depend, of course, then on how actually this war ends. Now, the point which I would like to address within that is next. What I would like to address are political paradigm shifts. So what we are seeing now, in my opinion, is that with the elections which are coming up, there will be a rise of populism and the rise of liberalism, if the polls, election polls, have any credence. The Russia-Ukrainian war, the second point, as a could be seen as a geopolitical and geoeconomical change agent. The third point is the emergence of multiple alliances. So on the one side, the BRICS and BRICS Plus, which sort of since 1st of January of this year does exist, as well as the non-aligned movement. That, of course, also takes into consideration the current multipolar alliances. The second last point is the nexus between multipolarity and populism, which I would like to address. And then the last point, or the conclusion of my talk, should be a post-Russian-Ukrainian war, multipolar populist world order. I hope I can get it all through in the given time. But I will do my best. I may have to shorten some of the thing. So what I'm trying to basically to say is the Russo-Ukrainian war has catalyzed significant political paradigm shifts, particularly seen in the transition from liberalism to populism across various global contexts. As a conflict unfolded, we have seen geopolitical ramification exposed by vulnerabilities of liberal democratic institutions like the World Trade Organization, the United Nations Security Council, the European Council, the United Nations General Assembly, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the European Central Bank. And those fueled disillusionment among populations with additional political establishment. We have seen deindustrialization, which causes, of course, unemployment, rising cost of living due to the various factors, but also the war, the political disempowerment of the general population. If you look in number of countries where actually the politicians are making quite openly the statement that they decide, even if those decisions are against the majority of their own population. Typical examples which I can find are basically in Germany at the moment. One of the reasons for this shift, my argument is, from liberalism is that the vast majority of population in the EU countries is becoming economically disadvantaged, disillusioned to the sanctions regime or the impact of the sanctions regime, which in my opinion has actually backfired. So what we have in terms of differences here is the liberal political leadership focuses on Western liberal values and ideologies at an expense of national interest as seen by the wider population. We also see that populist political leadership focuses on national economic issues and alleviation of the negative impact of sanctions. And thirdly, we see that the populism is emerging as an important political economic force with national focus, and thus populism is reshaping geopolitics and geoeconomics. I think what I should say, however, in my defense here is that I have taken quite unashamedly a realist point of view. Now let's come to our impact of elections. This year, 2024, is a year of many important and far-reaching elections. We just have witnessed one, and that is Putin has secured for another 6 years his presidency. But setting that aside, what is more important is that there are the European parliamentary elections, and there's a surge, as I said before, in many European countries, including the previous mentioned Germany, Austria, Hungary, France, Italy, Sweden, Finland, and others. Poland is the one exception which changed back, hopefully, to liberal democracy, whereas the others have shifted more or less towards populism. We have the US presidential elections. We have seen what has happened in Argentina, and cumulative, the EU elections tend to bring a political paradigm shift, in my opinion. So it will weaken the liberal rules-based world order. And here I'm referring to the order which emerged and has been changed since the Bretton Woods. And it is also strengthening the rise of multipolar populist world order. Now, with regards to the situation, I'm looking at the political paradigm shift, and that in terms of rise of populism and the demise of liberalism. And again, I'm coming back to the Russia-Ukrainian war, which is, in my opinion, a catalyst for further rise of populism. So the longer it goes, the more we probably see rise of populism, at least in the global north. We will also see eroding neoliberalism globally, I think. And we are going to, there will be highlighting weaknesses of institutions. Now, showing the war itself, or the effects of the war, will show the inability of liberal institutions to address complex international relations. In end effect, what I think what is going to happen is there's a popular disillusionment with the liberal ideologies in many countries and amongst the population. There is also potential effect of fueling the appeal of populist movements as against them, and the return of national interest and the sovereignty. If I look at the Russia-Ukrainian war as a geopolitical and geoeconomic change agent, I come to, in my analysis, the following understanding. We are seeing this information. Just bear with me. That's no. No, I must have missed a. Oh, okay. No. Sorry about that. How do I get to the previous slide? Here. So in the geopolitical, geoeconomic framework, I think that the shifts with impact on the liberal entities, like the NATO, the EU, and other alliances, will force nations to align themselves in a multiple scenario, be it with the Western alliances, being with the BRICS, being with potential a new non-aligned movement. I'm coming to that a little bit later. Now, the shifts also accelerate tension, prompting diplomatic recalibration. If you look at Hungary, Turkey, and the Western Balkans, now, although Hungary and Turkey are in NATO, they do not necessarily pull in the same direction. And Poland was the same pre-2023, and the Balkan states, Western Balkan states, is a big question mark. Now, the problem what we have with the Global South is that that many Global South countries are criticizing EU and the US and are basically seeing them with the Russian-Ukrainian war as a way of neocolonization. And we can see that because the Global South is non-compliant, or many of the Global South countries are not compliant with the Western sanctions. Now, so the next point is the emergence of multipolar alliances. So what we have emerging a picture is the Global South against the Global North. Now, the Global South shifts away from the Washington consensus and moves more towards the Beijing consensus. This is the shift from liberalism to national populism. There's a formation of new alliances, which I mentioned before, and that is the BRICS Plus, and there's also the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So we have still unity despite competing agenda, which just leads us potentially to multipolarity. I'm thinking about countries of the middle size or middle strong countries like Turkey, which is both has the feet in the Beijing consensus as well as the Washington consensus or the US alliance. Now, if you look at the BRICS and BRICS Plus, originally, as you know, BRICS was a bloc, I suppose is the right term, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. As from 1st of January 24, we have now added to it Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and that accounts for about 48% of world population. And in addition, there's a shift towards membership there. There are apparently another 30 countries have either applied for membership or have expressed interest. So what does it mean? What is actually BRICS Plus about? Now, BRICS Plus is generally positioning itself or the bloc against the existing liberal rule-based world order. And it also is pursuing a policy, or at least tentatively, of a force against this previously mentioned neocolonialism. In real terms, what it means that the West has lost the global hegemonic status, and we have seen the rise of regional middle class, and that is, again, like Iran, Turkey, and others. So if my analysis stands to reason, we are seeing actually advance of the multipolar world. The previously mentioned situation, I'd like to address it just very briefly, is the emergence of the multipolar alliances. So what we have is, if I set aside the multipolarity consisting of the Western Alliance and the BRICS plus bloc, there's a renaissance of non-aligned movement. It mirrors the non-aligned movement bloc which existed during the Cold War, which included India, Egypt, Ethiopia, former Yugoslavia, and others. Today, however, we have slightly different situation, that the non-aligned movement includes countries in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America, more so than it was in the previous non-aligned movement. So that means that we are looking at a return to the policy of a non-alignment, which is causing growing concern among policymakers in Western capital, because as a bloc, the non-aligned movement countries pursue national populist agendas to a large extent on the international stage. They have the capacity to challenge traditional alliances and the international norms in global forums like the UN, World Trade Organization, etc. And they can introduce increased competing layers of complexity as far as the geopolitical landscape is concerned. Being cognizant of the time, they haven't pushed all the slides. So let me look at the nexus between multipolarity and populism. In terms of the analysis, of my analysis, there is, as I mentioned before, emerging multipolar populism. I'm sorry, my time here in Australia is almost 2 o'clock, and my brain doesn't function that well, so I hope you forgive me for that. So let me come to the nexus between multipolarity and populism. So emerging multipolar populism has the following characteristics or tendencies, if you wish. It definitely will not replace the existing liberal world order, in my opinion, but the former will become a counterforce to the latter. So there will be a balance between those two. Subsequently, there will be most likely a form of coexistence and a nexus between those two, and perhaps more geopolitically constructs, alliances, and blocs will emerge and cooperate and coexist. But be this as it may, the nexus between multipolarity and populism represents a complex interplay of geopolitical dynamics and domestic political forces that shape the contemporary global landscape. This means that with a framework of emerging nexus between those two, the distribution of political, economic, and military power will change. Populism can, of course, attach itself to or become part of multilateralism, leading to multipolar world order or orders. Now, coming to my conclusion, and to look at the post-Russo-Ukrainian war multipolar populist world order, it's always a mouthful. There are three constituents which I have identified, which come out of the points I raised before. There's the multipolarity, there's populism, and there's the world order. Now, the advantages of this multipolar populist world order is that, seen from a realist point of view, is that it enhances national sovereignty. It also provides a greater diversity of geopolitical and geoeconomic perspectives. It resilience against hegemony and provides empowerment of grassroots movements, focuses on national political economic priorities, and provides protection of social cultural identity. I will finish with those unhappy thoughts, and I hand over back to the coordinator. Thank you.
Thank you, Viktor. Now you've been very concise and respectful of the time. We have about 20 minutes for discussion. Keep sending your comments online or raise your hand, please, with questions. I do not see any hands. Maybe I can start off. There is one. Okay. We have a question from Bulent Keynes. Thank you for these intriguing presentations. My question is for Dr. Stewart Patrick. As you delve into the complexity of reimagining global economic governance, how do you envision the influence of emerging AI technologies and new tools of information technology on the future landscape of global governance structure and institutions? Specifically, how might AI address challenges related to transparency, accountability, security, and ethical considerations, and what impact could it potentially have on the creation of new classes and class gaps in global scale?
Thank you very much. That's a fascinating question. There are tremendous efforts underway right now, both at the national level and increasingly at the multilateral level, to make sure that AI in and of itself is used in ethical and human-centered ways. And there was obviously a flurry of activity in late November and early December, including the UK Safety Summit, and that process continues. The difficulty is that although all countries are rhetorically committed to very high-minded adjectives like human-centered, ethical, transparent, accountable, etc., actually putting flesh on the details of those safety considerations in terms of what would be acceptable use cases, as they say, of AI, getting down into detail is much more complicated. And so trying to translate those into common standards and much less regulatory regimes is going to be very challenging, and particularly ensuring those are interoperable. I have some doubts as to whether or not open societies, or relatively open societies, will be able to reach some common ground with closed societies, authoritarian governments. So I'm not holding my breath that in the case of China, for instance, that one will be able to come up with any major standards. That being said, there is an effort underway by the Secretary General of the United Nations, appointed a high-level advisory body on AI, which made recommendations, preliminary recommendations in an interim report for how the multilateral system might try to advance, equitable access to AI, safe uses of AI, deal with issues of dual use problems of AI and its potential implications for proliferation, and such matters. And they're going to, you may be aware that there's something called the Summit of the Future, which the UN Secretariat and member states are going to hold in the opening of the UN General Assembly. As part of that, they're supposed to endorse a global digital compact. And some of the issues that you address are hopefully going to be taken up within that document that would be endorsed. Just more broadly, I should say that one of the conclusions of the paper that we wrote was that rather the people for a while were talking about an International Atomic Energy Agency for AI or an IPCC for AI. Our conclusion in the paper is that there will be a messier regime complex, basically of overlapping institutions for different functional purposes. And even within particular functions, there will be a number of different agencies so that there will not be a one entire effort to try to make everything coherent. And so a lot of the emphasis will be on making specific international agencies AI literate, as opposed to necessarily creating one institution to cover all of artificial intelligence. Apologies for the long-winded response, but hopefully that helped.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Luis.
Thank you, Professor.
Luisberg, please.
Yes, thank you. This is wonderful. Obviously, the complexity is huge, but I wonder, there is some hint, particularly in the last presentation, about the resistance. And in fact, of course, even in the United States, Trump is a resistance movement to the great progress that has been made in increased diversity and ethnic equality. And that is true in many, many parts of the world, I think. And particularly, I think we're neglecting to pay attention to the greater equality between men and women, and the role that women are increasingly playing. And that tends to make less reliance, I think, on military action. The data have suggested that in the past. And there are great progress being made in conflict resolution and ways in which public administration incorporates popular views. So I want to put that into the pot as well.
Okay, we have a question from Ertugrul İnsekol regarding how populist movements frame immigration policies in relation to democratic values. So I understand this to mean that they give that narrative of anti-immigrant stance as a protection of the well-being of the national community, right? So how would that then impact public perceptions of immigration? Did I understand this question correctly? I'm not sure.
Yes, Albena, thank you. Yes, it's correct. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I take a stab at that really quickly. I think that there is a there is a legitimate argument to be made there, that and a reflection of popular sovereignty, right? That in a democracy, democracy is a privileged polity in which and conceivably could be sharing certain values, political values. Sometimes it's done in sort of uglier ways, where there's a sense that the polity is sort of an ethno-nationalist sort of entity. But there could be, particularly when it comes to irregular immigration into a country. There can be, a democratic argument, a small d democratic argument that a polity should be able to control flows of people inside in a regular way, in and out of the country, and that's a fundamental way of protecting, in a sense, democratic values. So I can see how that argument could be made in a way that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a totally nativist and absurdly xenophobic response, because it's not as if uncontrolled migration is necessarily a good into a country.
I would like to come into that, if I may. I think we have to look at the migration crisis, and we have migration crisis obviously in the US, which is quite a different aspect, has different aspects from the migration crisis which exists in Europe, because they've been caused by two different things. We have to go, as far as Europe is concerned, in order to understand the migration crisis, we have to go back to Merkel's policies on migration, where she basically declared, when she was still the chancellor, that we can do it. There have been hundreds of thousands, I don't know now the figure exactly, of migrants came at that time. That was not about 2015, when the migration crisis started. Huge amount of people came basically to Europe and to Germany, and basically, well, some countries said we are not going to take migrants. It was Merkel who basically then put a policy into place so we can do it. Now, that is quite different from the migration crisis in the US, in my opinion. So when we talk about those things, we have to be quite careful in which context we put the migration issue, legal, social, or whatever other aspects we want to put onto it. So I would suggest we should keep those two issues separate, or the crisis separate.
Thank you for your comments. Especially, I was on the European side. Yes, as you said, Viktor. Yes, for the European aspect, I would like to ask, but thank you very much for the answers and comments. Thanks.
Okay, how about Amna Benamara? Go ahead, and I have a couple more.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So I'm Amna Benamara, a researcher. I'm originally from Tunisia, and I'm currently based in Slovenia. So I've been researching actually populism and populist politics, for more than 3 years, and I published a few academic articles on this. And I really want to thank the participant who actually spoke about the importance of discourse when it comes to populism. And my point here is that the power of populist discourse actually, or populist leaders, lies in their capacity to present themselves as the father presidents, the father leaders, the heroes, and the saviors. And this identity construction mechanism, does not only endow these leaders with the power and the moral authority to set the rules for the national home or the national house, but also to discipline and even punish those violating the rules of the national house, which are in certain cases migrants, or political elites, or the other more generally. So here, the importance of discourse, the importance of metaphors, the family metaphor, the house or the home metaphor, which is a kind of very, very strongly present in populist discourse, whether consciously or unconsciously orients the public towards this quest for being protected and for being guided by these leaders.
Very much, very true. Ibrahim Well, that was a remark. That was not a question. It was a very
Yeah.
yes,
So it
very
was
very appropriate component of a feature of populism. Ibrahim, you raised the hand. Please go. Unmute yourself.
Yeah, I would like to direct my question to Stewart. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation, and thank you very much for participating in our symposium. You have already partly mentioned, but just I would like to take attention again to the same point. So currently, the current globalization process is not working efficiently in distributive terms, in terms of distribution, equal distribution, fair distribution of global outcome is not effective so much. But we need an agent who can function as a game changer. It seems we don't see even such a political will in the United States who can trigger such a reform process so that the dominance of multinational companies can be balanced through some reform activities. I wonder who, what, or what kind of factors or which agents can lead such a process. Where lies the solution in that regard?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think that there are certain aspects of the Biden administration have been more radical and progressive than he actually ran as a candidate. People sometimes joke that he ran against Bernie Sanders, but then once when he was elected, he actually governed a little bit more like Bernie Sanders than in terms of than one would have imagined from his sort of previous record as a legislator. So there have been moves and legislative victories like the Inflation Reduction Act and the infrastructure bill. There's also been, and this is more on the national security front, but the CHIPS Act to regulate supply of chips to advanced semiconductors to China. But I would imagine that if Biden is elected again, if he's reelected, that there will be some, and if he has a majority in both houses of Congress. Again, these are highly unknown as to whether or not that will occur, and it's quite up in the air at this stage. That he would continue moving in a more progressive direction. The one area where I believe that I just don't see much willingness to really do what needs to be done is in regulating technology platforms. This is the level of concentration of wealth is so extraordinary, and of course, when this happened in the early part of the 20th century, there was even Republican president Teddy Roosevelt made his name in some ways as a trust buster, basically breaking up some of the monopoly power of these just massive technology platforms. And I just don't see a significant movement in that direction. Some movement, he has proposed taxes on billionaires, etc. But I don't see enough of a break with the very market-based system that distinguishes much of the United States from Europe in this regard.
Thank you, Stewart. I will take one last question, and this is from Selçuk Gültasli. Given this is a question to Professor JAKUPEC, given the surge of national populism in Europe and the possibility of a huge win for populists at the upcoming European Parliament elections, do you think the European Union, as a liberal institution, has the resilience to counter this populist offensive? Great question to finish.
Yes, it is a great question. And I have to do a little bit of crystal balling here. It depends on so many factors. I would say that there is a strong potential, or at least a potential, that EU, as we know it today, will not necessarily exist in 5 to 10 years' time. We will see that there are going to be splinter groups in there, and which will make then the EU potentially unworkable. You will have potentially depends on how many new countries will join EU, of course, but if you have the Western Balkans joining in, we can see a potential renaissance of the of Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, which was impacting on the EU. And we don't know about some of the smaller countries, which also have the voice and how they're going to align themselves with the bigger countries. So I would say that there are going to be rocky times ahead.
Right.
I don't know if I answered the question, but too much of crystal balling still there.
The jury is still out. Yeah, we'll
Yeah.
rest, we see. Irina von Wiese has a question. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Albena. No, just a quick remark following up on Viktor. I understand your realism, but I would want to give maybe a slightly more optimistic outlook on the European elections, having seen how, in reality, those alliances within the European Parliament at least work. Even if, as is predicted by a number of pollsters, there should be a resurgence and potentially a majority of the anti-democratic, anti-European forces, notably on the far right, after the next elections, which I think is still in doubt. But even if there is, I think an experience has shown that those forces are not united. They have tried in the past to unite within the European Parliament. They have failed simply because their national populist strands are so far apart from each other, and they disagree on so many precise policy issues, because obviously populists don't do precise policy as a general rule. That we've seen in the past, there's those attempts, particularly by ID, on the right and the non-inscrits, that those who are not members of any particular bloc, and the far left on the other side have just failed. So I am a bit more optimistic. I do think the pro-European forces, as much as they may disagree, in practice will try to rally together, that is the four centrist parties, in order to keep out the populists. I hope, of course, that I'm right. There is, I don't want to downplay the challenges and the threat that the resurgence of national populists everywhere pose. But I would like to give this kind of more optimistic view, maybe to conclude this really interesting panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you to our presenters and to the audience so engaged. Let us have a 10-minute break before the next panel and convene at 3:30 Central European time. So in 10 minutes.